This week on Quadriga, getting involved, German arms for Iraq. Germany wants to send weapons to Kurdish forces in northern Iraq. Pressure has mounted on Berlin to move beyond humanitarian aid and to assist Iraqis under assault from the Islamic State. Hundreds of thousands have been displaced. Germany's foreign and defense ministers say they will closely coordinate with the EU as they move ahead. France and Britain are already supplying weapons to Kurdish fighters. But sending arms of any kind to a war zone is controversial and generally prohibited by German law, not least because those weapons could later end up in the wrong hands. A watershed moment in German politics. Can German weapons help stop the Sunni insurgency? Or could they fuel a future conflict? Your host this week, Ali Aslan.
Hello and welcome to a new edition of Quadriga. Well, the German government has finally made a decision whether or not to supply the Kurds in northern Iraq with arms. And the answer is yes, it will. What repercussions will this decision have on the conflict? And could the decision perhaps even backfire? Those are the questions I'm going to talk about on today's show, together with three experts, all who've been following the story very closely. So I'm very happy to welcome to the show Michael Stürmer, who's the senior correspondent at the German daily Die Welt. He's a renowned historian and a specialist on foreign affairs and security issues. Burkhard Birke is a political editor and presenter at Germany's public broadcasting radio network Deutschlandradio. Previously, he reported as a foreign correspondent from Washington, Brussels, London, and Paris. And Christine Hellberg is a journalist covering international relations with a focus on the Middle East. For most of the past decade, she was posted as a foreign correspondent in the Syrian capital, Damascus. Michael Stürmer, the decision has finally been made, the decision that the political leadership in Germany has been agonizing over for the better part of the summer. Now it's clear the German government will provide weapons to Kurdish Peshmerga in northern Iraq to help them in their fight against the so-called Islamic State. Is this the right decision?
Well, first of all, my question is what weapons? We are not supplying tanks, guns. We are supplying all kinds of equipment. Some of this we haven't even got. So it will be a very modest contribution, and on the battlefield it will not make a sizable difference. It is more a moral decision, and it recognizes that these terrible events in the Middle East may have something to do with our own interests and our own security. So it's more on the psychological and strategic level than on the actual equation dynamics on the battlefield.
So, but do you welcome the decision?
I think it was high time, and it was an undignified drama that we saw first, no, never, we'll not do anything, which corresponded, of course, to the vast majority of the Germans. 74% say nothing for us. This is obviously on a different planet, the other side of the moon, while the government then took the courageous decision, which is probably not being welcomed by the majority of the Germans.
Indeed, it's not, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But Christine Hellberg, so the decision has been made, and clearly the German Foreign Minister Steinmeier, as well as the Defense Secretary of Defense von der Leyen, have said, yes, this is the right decision for Germany to get involved. Do you agree?
I agree, but I would say that it's not only about arming the Kurdish Peshmerga. We have to be careful because it's not the Kurdish Peshmerga that will finish up with the Islamic State. Islamic State is trying to build up a caliphate over national borders. We should stop thinking in national borders, in nation states. So we have to think further on. And I don't say that we have to engage militarily very much personally and actively from the West. I would say we should do as little as possible to engage ourselves. We have to learn our lessons from George W. Bush, the invasion in Iraq, which is to a great extent responsible for the rise of the Islamic State, if we go back in history in the last decade. So we have to be careful, we have to do as little as possible militarily to engage ourselves, but we have to look for our partners in the region, the armed groups in the region who are confronting the Islamic State. And these are not only the Peshmerga.
But that sounds more like the old German foreign policy, in the sense, let the other ones do the fighting and we'll sit back and perhaps...
No, we should arm them. We should support them with everything they need for this fight against the Islamic State. But it's not the West who should solve this, because it's the West who is responsible with other factors for the rise of the Islamic State.
Burkhard Birke, now the decision has to be made whether Parliament, the German Parliament, has to actually approve this decision made by the political leadership. There are various voices out there who say, yes, of course, Parliament has to be involved. Others say, not so much. This very much is an emergency state, therefore we can decide on our own. What's your take?
Personally, I'd welcome if the Parliament had a say in this, because it's a fundamental switch and change of German foreign policy. I mean, we are sort of taking more responsibility. We can look at what President Gauck said already at the security conference in Munich, saying that Germany needs to be more present and needs to show more presence on the international scene, take up its responsibility. We have a humanitarian catastrophe with the refugees in northern Iraq, so that might be a reason for delivering arms, which is actually, strictly speaking, in the sense of the letter of the law, against our rules, but we can make an exception to the rule. But as long as we deliver weapons to Saudi Arabia, to Qatar, to all these states who are, in one way or another, mangling in this conflict, supporting indirectly or directly the Islamic State, then we should also give weapons to the Kurds, in this case, to stop this humanitarian catastrophe. But we need to rethink generally our weapons export policy, and we should have the Parliament have a say in this, because it's a fundamental change.
It is a change, and as you've already mentioned, it is also against the law, strictly speaking, because the German law constitution forbids armed deliveries to war zones and crisis areas.
No, the German constitution says we should not engage in aggressive war. That is a very much a big difference. The German constitution isn't so particular. It doesn't say you can deliver Red Cross material, but you cannot send guns. No.
But the rule is very clear that no crisis area is supposed to receive German weapons, as long as there are exceptions. And in this case, actually, formally, the German government needs to ask the Iraqi government if they are allowed to deliver the weapons to the Kurds. I don't know if they're really going to do this.
But there is an absurdity in the whole thing, because we have restricted ourselves not delivering selling weapons to tension-afflicted areas. Now, where else do you need weapons? It's a bit absurd, and this absurdity has survived for a long time, and now the world is aflame in many places, and we have to consider our own interests. This is always presented as a moral decision. For me, it is also a moral decision, but above all, it's a decision which we have to find according to our interests. And this is not somewhere, as I said, on the other side of the moon. This is pretty close. This is on the threshold of Europe. And what happens today in Syria, or what used to be Syria, can happen the day after tomorrow in European capitals. David Cameron just came out with a statement which I found very strong, where he said we may face those guns, the Al-Qaeda guns, in our capitals.
Christine Hellbeck?
Yes, but I think we have to make something very clear here. I think the only reason to intervene militarily from any other foreign state is responsibility to protect. Now, this is about saving lives. This is about rescuing civilians who are under acute threat from the Islamic State. This is not about political interests. This is not about economic interests. It's not even about our values. I don't think that we should send weapons or anything else in a region for our values, our interests. It comes together with this. I agree with you. In the end, it is in our interest, because these terrorists might go and they might blow a bomb in any European capital.
It's an academic differentiation.
But the international law has this principle, responsibility to protect. And this should be the only reason, and this should be the only measure that we consider in such a situation. Do we save civilian lives or not? And then, of course, we can not only think about northern Iraq, then we have to think about Syria.
But it's a dangerous step to do anyway, because just imagine the Kurds taking up these weapons in a couple of years against Turkey because they want to have their own Kurdistan, their state, and they turn these weapons against a NATO partner of Germany. So we have seen the same scenario in the 90s when the Reagan administration gave weapons to the Mujahideen, and we all know what happened 10 years later or 11 years later after 9/11. So we have to consider the dangers of such a decision.
This is exactly what I'm saying. This is the big difference. In Afghanistan, it was about political interests. It was about the big Cold War against Russia and against the Soviet Union. Now it's only about civilians sitting there on the top of the hills. They need to be rescued. So this is the responsibility to protect is really a new fundamental principle of international law, and where, if not in Iraq, in Syria, we should apply it.
And the fear that the weapons could fall into the wrong hands is very real. And we'll look at the example of Libya, where French weapons ended up in Mali, and certainly now are causing great deal of distress in Libya itself. Of course, there's talk that the IS, the Islamic State themselves, seized U.S. weapons from the Iraqi army.
Yeah.
So, Michael Schimmer, do you see, the danger that German weapons will fall into the wrong hands eventually?
Well, first of all, what weapons and how many, I don't really think that would make much of a difference, whatever we do now. And I agree, responsibility to protect is at least United Nations consensus. We are having some kind of firm ground in international law, and let us use that. I would add, of course, that the question of national interest, national security comes in, and that for me is at least 50% of the decision. And I agree with the decision. Of course, you never know where it ends up. One of the people who were supported in Afghanistan against the Soviets was Osama bin Laden. He learned the trade of killing in the mountains of Afghanistan. And of course, he also, perhaps not personally, but his gang used American high-class weaponry.
Burkhard Birger, some even say the move, not just, of course, on the part of Germany to supply weapons, but the EU in general, EU foreign ministers have all approved this move, by the way, right, would hasten and speeden up the disintegration of the state of Iraq. Do you see the danger here?
Well, what is there to disintegrate it? It is already disintegrated, and you have to have a cantonization. So I don't think the Iraqi state is going to continue in the future as one state, as one nation. I don't see this. And actually, we already do have an independent or partially independent Kurdistan in the north. I don't think the Shia and the Sunnis will ever get peacefully together, even with this new head of government. I really don't see this. I mean, this whole place is a mess, and actually a mess that goes back to the colonial times when the Picot-Sykes line was drawn up against all ethnies, against all sense of religious respect, and so this goes back a long time.
This goes back a long time, and the other problem we have here, Christian Hellbeck, is that the Kurds themselves in northern Iraq are not unified. In fact, the PKK has already come out against the move to supply weapons to the Kurdish Peshmerga, northern Iraq, led by Barzani. It's a bit of a mess, no?
It's very complicated. I mean, we should really hope that at least the Kurds among themselves would unify in this fight, and that it's not about...
They haven't done so for a long time.
They haven't done so, but there are some positive steps here. What is important is that we don't draw a further split between the Kurds and the Arabs. This is very important because we have a lot of hatred growing between the two ethnics. We have a lot of problems between Arabs and Kurds, not only in Iraq, but especially in Syria. So what is important for me is to create a unified front against the Islamic State. And who is the most important part in this? The Sunnis of the region. Who will win against the Islamic State? Not the Kurds, not the Shiites. The ones who have to win against the Islamic State are the Sunnis, because they have the tools ideologically to confront this group, to say, this is not Islam. This is not what we want. We don't want to behead people. This is not our form of living the Islam. So we have to create one unified front against the Islamic State with all the religious and confessional groups in the region and all the ethnics. So I think we should support the efforts of Kurds and Arabs to unify, and maybe we should even put conditions on sending arms. If you have among your soldiers Arabs and Christians and Yazidis and whoever is in this region, especially in Syria, there is a big responsibility to have some efforts in unifying the rebels against this Islamic State. We have a lot of different groups who fight the Islamic State, and there should be some kind of an effort from outside to help them unify in this.
Do we have the intellectual capacity and the material capacity for remote control, managing this
it's not remote control. The groups are identified. I mean, the moderate rebels in Syria that fight against the
remote
Islamic
control
State.
from Berlin or Washington.
No, but we have our partners in the region. We are supposed to talk to them and to convince them of some steps and to just, we are supposed to just help and support initiatives that are already there. It's not that we say you should do this.
Politics must take the lead. Politics in the region must take the lead.
Yes, but without telling them what to do, but just to find the people in this region who act in this way of thinking, and in this interest.
But you need to get the protector powers into the boat, as we say in German. You need to get Turkey, who's supporting some Sunni groups. You need to get Saudi Arabia. You need to get Qatar and Iran supporting the Shiites. You need to get those powers around the table and negotiate and make their influence really strong on these groups that are fighting on the ground.
Because they are all there, and they are all supporting the groups that are fighting Islamic
Exactly. That's
State.
why you need, and we, the Germans, the EU, the United States, need to put pressure on Turkey, on Saudi Arabia. That's what drives me crazy. Why are we delivering lots of weapons to Saudi Arabia, and at the same time there is evidence that Saudi Arabian people are supporting this Islamic State?
No, but this is really wrong. This is really, it's a lot of times people get this wrong. It's not the state of Saudi Arabia.
No, I said people in Saudi Arabia. I said people in Saudi Arabia.
This is not a policy of the Saudi government. We are delivering arms to the Saudi government. I'm completely against delivering arms to Saudi Arabia. This is another question.
On the side of people in Saudi Arabia. I did not say the government.
They're all afraid of the Islamic State. They're all afraid of Al-Qaeda in the first place.
Yeah.
Nor the Saudis, nor the Qataris have any interest in these jihadi movements in the region. They are completely against it. The Saudis are financing inside Syria Islamic groups, Syrian Islamists who are fighting against Bashar al-Assad and who are fighting at the same time on the second front against the Islamic State, in the south especially. This is the Islamic Front in Syria. Islamic Front are the Syrian Islamists fighting against Bashar al-Assad and taking up arms against the Islamic State. This is the Saudi allies in Syria. But they are already fighting the people who stand up against the Islamic State. But we have to, I completely agree, we have to come together to put pressure and to talk to these states who have a vital interest.
And of course, if we look at the numbers, Michael Sturmer has already mentioned them, more than 70% of Germans oppose this move. They don't want any German arms to be supplied to northern Iraq, or elsewhere for that matter. They prefer military restraint. This is more or less the thinking on the part of the Germans. Is it an outdated thinking, or do you think it's yes, understandable?
It's understandable, and my generation, who is the post-war generation, was raised in this culpability complex, and we have done all this horror in the Second World War. We have initiated, or we were majorly involved in 2 world wars, and so Germany should abstain. But when there are humanitarian catastrophes and there are people who need to be protected, then I think Germany needs to take up more responsibility. There I agree with Joachim Gauck, our president, who limits this idea, though, to humanitarian things. And we need to take up more responsibility. The world and Europe expects this from Germany. But that's why I said at the beginning, we need the parliament to agree. Because if you say 70% of the people disagree, who represents the people? In the parliament, it's the deputies, it's our Bundestags. So they should have a vote and a say in this, yeah? But I think we isolated ourselves when Great Britain, when France and the US decided to at least to have airstrikes on Libya at the time. And Germany, ever since then, was very isolated on the international scene. And I think what we are seeing now with our foreign minister and our defense minister, they want a shift. They want Germany to take up its responsibility that the others expect from us.
And Michael Stimmer, the figure of 70% of Germans opposed stands somewhat in stark contrast to the other figure, namely that Germany is the third largest arms exporter in the world after the US and Russia. In fact, it has made revenues, arms sales are the reason for revenues of 8 billion euros just last year alone. So my question is, there seems to be a discrepancy between what the people want and what is actually happening on the ground.
The people want the cake and eat it. Want to have the cake and eat it, of course, flourishing exports, whatever, and the differentiation between arms and non-lethal arms and lethal arms is very complex and open to interpretation. Yeah, it's the normal human thing. Have the cake and eat it. And also, I don't think that the government and the parliament as a whole, because the parliament has also the key responsibility, has always had it, has claimed it, and hasn't exercised it, because with the responsibility goes leadership. And the German public, I think, was troubled by the toing and froing of the government over the last few weeks. There was no leadership, not from the top and not from the ranks of the Foreign Secretary and the Defense Secretary. So that's the normal response. If people are not presented with a strong element of reasoning and from time to time a glance at the map, this is all very close. And this doesn't happen elsewhere. This has enormous repercussions for life in our cities.
So lack of leadership,
3 million Turks.
Lack of German leadership here?
Lack of leadership in Germany translates into lack of German leadership. And there is a lot of work to be done and a lot of arguments to be exchanged and a lot of guidance to be given.
I mean, I understand all these Germans. I completely agree with the sentence that arms cannot solve political problems and that, you know, the world is full of arms, we don't need more arms. These are all sentences that we would all like to agree. I think the Germans are just not used to this kind of policy that you have sometimes to engage even militarily. And I mean, this sentence that we have heard from a lot of German politicians that we have already enough arms in the region, we don't need more arms to solve the problem. It's very cynical for any Iraqi and Syrian in the region because who has the arms? The arms are right now in the wrong hands. Of course, Bashar al-Assad in Syria has everything he needs, barrel bombs and what have you to kill civilians in Aleppo and all the major cities of Syria. And of course, the Islamic State has everything they've dreamed of since they took Mosul and they have all this modern American military equipment. So who has the arms right now? Can we say, oh, is everything there, so let's just lay back and leave the civilians to these brutal forces? No, they are in the wrong hands, and this is why not delivering arms means we don't stay neutral, we don't stay out of the game, you know, we are just objective. No, we take sides of the stronger, of the ones who have the arms. So this is why...
Picking up on your point, I mean, where does Assad get its weapons from? Russia. So that's another point why we need to negotiate with Russia also what the Ukrainian conflict is concerned. So, I mean, we need Russia in the boat. I mean, we are in the post-Cold War area, and I mean, sometimes I miss the stability we had in the Cold War because the front lines were very clear, but now there are very dirty games being played here.
We're going back to the Cold War.
Yeah, we're actually going back to Cold War time. Yeah, so we really need to get Russia.
Stability.
Without stability, exactly.
Cold War, fine, it had a price, but it also gave stability.
So we need a twofold strategy here then, if I understand you correctly. Supply arms, but also talk to the countries that are fueling these proxy wars then?
Absolutely. You need a political solution for Iraq. I mean, the Americans have left a mess, but they're not the only ones who are responsible for this mess, even though the invasion was, in my opinion, completely wrong and nuts. And but, I mean, the conflicts were there before. I mean, it was not that Sunni and Shiites were living in peaceful, happily ever together.
No, they were living together quite happily, actually.
Well, Saddam Hussein was sort of...
yeah, it's a dictatorship, and under the dictatorship, of course, people were not focused on the religion, and people would marry, you know, among Sunnis and Shiites. It was quite normal, you know. I mean, the Americans did two major mistakes. They dissolved the army, they dissolved the Ba'ath Party, and then they thought that their own soldiers would, you know, control this made them occupiers, And they left all these soldiers and party leaders without a job, so they all engaged against the U.S. Occupation. So this created Al-Qaeda in Iraq.
But I think the hatred is so big that I can't imagine the Iraqi people living together in one nation state. At least you have a very federal system with very regional autonomy. I mean, Kurdistan is already autonomous, but you have maybe a Shiite region or a Sunni region. I think that's the only way you can have, and you could even expand this over to some Syrian people, because the Kurds in Syria would probably much rather live with the Kurds from northern Iraq than in Syria.
Well, looking at the current state of Iraq, it is indeed very hard to imagine how this country is going to move forward as a unified territory from now on. Germany, as we said, third largest arms exporter in the world. 60%, more than 60% of these arms go to countries outside of the EU and NATO, mainly to countries like, already been said, Saudi Arabia, to Qatar. Algeria.
Israel is one of the more
Israel
biggest
also.
receivers.
It begs the question that, is there a strategy behind this? Are these arms sales randomly being taken place? Because why not, for instance, supply Ukraine with arms then?
It's the law of supply and demand. To supply Ukraine, I think, would be very foolish and highly dangerous with weapons, because this would be a hostile act towards Russia. And I think we've plenty of hostile acts against Russia without having to add weapons for Ukraine.
So it's a pick and choose strategy then?
There is no major strategy behind it. It's the marketplace. And of course, some particularly unsavory regimes don't get the best weapons. But on the whole, this figure of, I think, 5 billion euros. 8 billion.
8 last
well,
year.
it isn't all that much. The budgets, the defense budgets of the world are a mountain, and this is a molehill. I'm not belittling it, but this doesn't make much of a difference. The Soviets or the Russians, the post-Soviet Russians and the Americans are filling the arsenals left and right. What we are doing is, to a large extent, of course, NATO and EU. And otherwise, much of this has been stopped in recent weeks and months.
And from the looks of it, it will be stopped even further if we can believe Vice Chancellor and Economy Minister Sigmar Gabriel, who made it very clear, Germany's Vice Chancellor, that he wants to restrict the sale of arms, which of course now has the arms industry up in arms. And
he's looking at the 74%.
Wow.
And he is not listening to the IG Metall, the trade unions.
The trade unions. But this is a discussion. I mean, the decision to supply Kurds in northern Iraq with arms, the timing is rather peculiar because it coincides with another debate going on in Germany right now, namely to do exactly the opposite, to restrict arms sales from now on.
Correct, because it's actually a contradiction, because on the one hand, our Vice Chancellor, Sigmar Gabriel from the Social Democrats, is saying actually we should really focus on our arms exports only to nations who are secure, respecting human rights, and he wants to actually restrict the arms export, and at the same time you have this decision of supplying arms to the Kurds. But you have to distinguish. One is an emergency situation, a humanitarian crisis where Germany has to take up its responsibility, and the other one is the general direction of our arms sales. And I think Sigmar Gabriel is completely right in rethinking our strategy of exporting, our tanks, Leopard, to Saudi Arabia, to Qatar, because these are not following our standards, states that necessarily respect human rights as we expect nations to do. And we're talking about an industry who employs roughly 100,000 people in Germany directly, and I think all over 350,000 jobs depend on it. Of course, there is an economic argument, yeah? You might lose some jobs, but is it worth it? I mean, to stand up for our values, to protect human rights, and maybe lose some jobs? I think it's worth it.
Well, a clear statement, Michael Stürmer. Would you agree with the Vice Chancellor then, with Sigmar Gabriel?
I would say yes and amen. The question, there are many questions. The devil is always in the detail. And I I think Gabriel is arguing in a way that, of course, is in the line of argument of the SPD. Steinmeier, of course, has other concerns as a foreign minister, and we'll see what comes out. So far, what we are delivering to the Kurds, what we have to give them, deliver them, sell them, probably not sell, is almost insignificant in military terms. It's more a moral question, a question of principle. And as we said in the beginning of this program, it is a break with the past, but not all that radical. We've moved slowly, consciously, half-consciously, not unconsciously, in that direction. And of course, responsibility to protect is there. Responsibility to protect is a very dangerous element. It was celebrated when it was introduced in the United Nations a few years ago, and there's a long debate and an honorable debate in which many good people have taken part. But what if Putin says tomorrow, or even today, or yesterday, I have the responsibility to protect my fellow Russians who are under terrible stress in Ukraine, where there is suppression of the Russian language and all kinds of horrible things.
That's the dilemma. That's the dilemma of our foreign policy, because with the same argument that the United States is bombing ISIS in northern Iraq, I mean, Putin could say, well, I have to go into eastern Ukraine to protect the people there because they're being slaughtered by the Ukrainian army. So, and Putin and the Russian government are using this argument. I mean, they're always referring to the NATO intervention in Kosovo against Serbia at the time in the 90s. So
without a United Nations mandate.
So that is why, and the United Nations have been mentioned here. I mean, this is why we need to get the United Nations involved and maybe convince Russia. Of course, Russia has the right to veto there. But I mean, we need to get the United Nations involved in a solution for these crises.
Christian Hellberg, Michael Schirmer doesn't seem to think that German weapons in northern Iraq will make any difference. That's just a...
That's probably true, because the Americans are delivering a lot more, and so it doesn't make this much of a difference if the Germans deliver or not, or the French. I mean, depending on what exactly we deliver. I agree. But I think, I mean, we cannot compare what's happening in the Ukraine with what Bashar al-Assad is doing to his people. Excuse me. I mean, we are talking about a completely other... The argument, I know. Yes, we should go there, and yes, but I mean, we are talking about genocide. Usually the responsibility to protect comes in a situation where a government is not able to protect its own people. Now, in Syria, it's not the government who is not able to protect, it's the government itself who is killing its people. So this is really genocide. I mean, this is really this is really a case for responsibility to protect. The NATO engaged in Libya, where Gaddafi was about to commit eventually a genocide, you know, and we intervened. Now, in northern Iraq, it's not the Iraqi state. I mean, it's the Iraqi state who is not able to protect its people. That's true. So this would be the case for responsibility to protect. But I think we have to look very carefully in the cases. And if Russia now says, you know, we have to protect our fellow Russians in... Yani, it's not comparable, I think.
It's not comparable, I agree, but the argument is being used because, I mean, if you talk to Russians, hardliners, or if you talk to some people from the pro-Russian rebels there, they say, our civilians are being attacked by the Ukrainian army. They're terrorizing us, so let's cry for help. So,
yes. But going back to the United Nations, I mean, I completely agree that we usually should get the United Nations in the boat, and they are the ones who should take the big decision, and the Security Council is the place to take such a decision. But again, coming back to Syria, the United Nations and the Security Council has completely failed. The role of the Security Council is ridiculous, and it's a shame. It's shameful, actually, if you look at the Syrian case.
Couldn't we think of a humanitarian corridor in northern Iraq, for instance, decided by the United Nations?
Yes, in Iraq, yes, and then we sent the Yazidis through a safe corridor to Syria, and then in Syria we let them down towards the Islamic State. The Islamic State has its bases in Raqqa for over a year. This is the provincial capital in Syria, Raqqa. They are taking control over Deir ez-Zor. They are standing in the front of Aleppo. We have a very loud cry for help from the head of the civilian council, the civil council of Aleppo, who's crying for help, the Americans, and say, where are you? They are about to, the Assad regime has put a siege on Aleppo. Now the Islamic State is coming from the other side to Aleppo. Aleppo will be finished in a couple of weeks if we don't do anything. You know, I mean, it's hundreds of thousands who are already living under the rule of the Islamic State inside Syria.
But
so,
are you now not arguing implicitly for boots on the ground?
No, I'm completely against boots on the ground because we have the groups there, the local groups who stand up against the Islamic State. They are all identified because they receive some little help from the Americans, but it's not enough. They have to upgrade their military help. And very quickly, because otherwise we'll lose the fight against the Islamic State. We cannot win it in Iraq. We'll lose it in Syria.
Too late.
It's not too late.
Not too late, not yet.
Well, troubling times
High time.
anyway. I think we can agree on that. Troubling times all around. And Burkhard Birke, the decision to supply Kurds with arms, with German arms, comes at a time, again, at a very interesting time, because so much has been made of the terms new German responsibility. You know, it was put forth by President Gauck, it was put forth by Foreign Minister Steinmeier, Defense Minister von der Leyen, the new German responsibilities. Is this a litmus test here in northern Iraq, if Germany is really willing to follow through with what is?
It's a first step towards a new policy. To put it bluntly, I mean, Michael Stemmer has mentioned it before, but I mean, I'm actually missing leadership by my Chancellor. She's always with her famous way of reacting at the last moment. I mean, she was really being pushed by her Minister of Defense and by her Foreign Minister, because at the beginning of last week, the official wording was no weapons into this crisis area, and towards the middle of the week, yes, we think about it, and all of a sudden we delivered. So. I actually am doubting the leadership capacity of Angela Merkel, and this is in other fields as well. In the financial crisis, she's always been being pushed by Sarkozy at the time, the French president, and she's always taken the decisions at this last possible moment to avoid some deeper damage. And what I'm missing is leadership in this case, really leadership, and say, okay, we have this responsibility not only for these arms deliveries, for internationally, we have to stand up more for what we are. Economically, a big country, powerful, and the Americans and others expect Germany to have the leadership role in Europe. And unfortunately, the French, our partner, due to their economical and financial problems, they are not as strong as they used to be.
Michael Stemmer, is this decision a watershed moment in German foreign policy? Are we indeed seeing a new German foreign policy?
Yes, it's not a turnaround, but it's a watershed moment. Yes, I would agree. There's one point which I would like to mention when you talk about weapons, whatever kind of weapons and whatever quantities and quality, to the Kurds. The vast majority of Kurds live in today's Turkey. We are talking about a Kurdish quasi-state in the north of Iraq. And we are not talking about the 7 million Kurds in Iran. And Iran will be very, very inimical to any kind of Kurdish state emerging. So this needs a kind of fine-tuning, and this is far beyond the kind of leadership that Berlin has shown or even Washington has shown. There is a new crisis brewing next year, the year after next, because of this Kurdish problem, which has not been resolved for at least a century.
But which is important here, I think, is the Erdogan government has very strong economic ties with northern Iraq. They have very strong political ties to the leadership, to Masoud Barzani, the head of the autonomous region in northern Iraq. It's a de facto state already in northern Iraq, what we see there. Erdogan doesn't have a problem with this de facto state. It's behind the mountains, and he was wise enough to engage with this government. He has a problem with the PKK, and he has a problem with the PYD, which is the PKK sister party inside Syria. So Erdogan does have a problem if we say, okay, we will not arm only the Peshmerga in northern Iraq, let's go and deliver arms to the PYD, because they are defending Kurdish cities like Kamishli or other smaller villages in northern Syria against the Islamic State. I mean, the PYD would be one of the groups inside Syria who should be supported against the Islamic State. This is where Erdogan will have a problem. It is complicated.
It is complicated, yes, for certain. And the US and other EU partners, as you already mentioned, have asked Germany to grow up, if you will, to assume its responsibility on the world stage, not just economically, but also in crises like this. Again, is this a new German foreign policy we're seeing?
Emerging. We've seen it emerging, and I think we are living a very, very interesting moment of how this foreign policy is being shaped. But it's a process. It's not just like a big bang. Now we are on the world scene and we manage it all. But you saw it as well as Frank-Walter Steinmeier, foreign minister, who united the Russian foreign minister, the Ukrainian and the French, and they had this crisis talk. And maybe it is an outcome that Putin is meeting now the Ukrainian president in Minsk next week. And so maybe this is an outcome. Germany is trying to assume a bigger role on the international floor.
I think it would make it easier for German people to accept this if it was all embedded, and this is what the German government of course tries, in a European policy, in going forward with its partners. This is what they're always trying. But until now, what we saw, as you just mentioned before, Mr. Burke, was that Germany fell behind its responsibility. They let they let others do the job. So now it's time to go for this responsibility among the European community, within NATO, with maybe at side by side with the American government. This would be a good step, I think.
You're not dreaming.
I'm dreaming?
Yeah, a European security and defense policy is non-existent. It's all words, words, words.
It should be existing.
And when the 28 foreign ministers come together, it doesn't mean that they have a common policy. They use the same words, but that's all.
Well, I think we made it abundantly clear that the decision, any decision on the stage, is extremely complicated. Thank you to my guests for a very enlightening talk on this important subject matter. We will, of course, continue to follow this story as it unfolds. Thank you out there for tuning in, and looking forward to seeing you again next week for a new edition of Quadriga.